the sense that the goals that I looked for and hoped for have all disappeared. Remember, greenhouse gases are getting to be more being injected into the environment now than they were a few years ago. Biodiversity is disappearing more rapidly than it was, and we're adding more toxic chemicals than we ever have before to the global environment, and we had quite a discussion of that in the meeting. So that is certainly my personal view of it. On population, all of us who looked at it in detail think there's no hope at all with any foreseeable technologies of supporting even 7 billion people over the long term. When you look at what the population size might be proper and might be sustainable, about all you can say is for the foreseeable future we're in overshoot. That is, we have more people than the planet can permanently support. It takes a long time to change behavior of that sort. You can't change the population situation instantaneously, not at least by any humane method that you want. But I don't think there's any reason to argue about whether we can eventually support 7, 3, or 2 billion, whatever it is. It's going to take 50 years to even get started with the kind of shrinkage that we obviously need now if we're going to do it humanely, and there'll be a long time to discuss that. Consumption's a different issue. As we learned in England and the United States in the early 40s, you can change consumption patterns overnight if you have the right incentive. And consumption is the other side of the population issue. They're tied together like the length and width of a rectangle are for giving you the area. You can't say it's population or it's per capita consumption. It's a combination of the two. Consumption, we can change, but it's a much more difficult issue. We know a lot about how you change population. We don't know a damn thing about what you can do about consumption, and the economists are just starting to look at it.
Emil, why don't you go next, then Suki, then Dr. Sato. Emil.
The question is not climate change. It's development that needs to change. The development conducted this far, GDP-oriented, stress only economic growth, and environment is a byproduct destruction of the environment. What we are proposing is moving away from the GDP type of development into a three-pronged attack of an economic growth that takes into account social development, poverty eradication, social injustice, and the carrying capacity of nature in environmental development. It's not that it's climate change, it's not that you're pessimistic, it is the need for changing the development. It must be much more sustainable. It is possible. So if we follow the path of sustainable development, we can survive. And for this, the scientists know the answer, environmentalists know the answer, social scientists know the answer. The key questions are the politician willing to change from a Wall Street-oriented type of development to a Main Street, from Davos type of a World Economic Conference to a Sustainable Development Conference. It's a change in attitude. It's a different type of development, not because of climate change, but because it's the wrong part of development.
So we are quite disillusioned by the rate of progress. As you've heard, climate change at an unprecedented rate, biodiversity loss unprecedented. We still have a billion people go to bed hungry every night. We have still almost half the world's population, 3 billion people still living on $2 a day. Lack of access to clean modern energy, lack of access to water. So the development paradigm is wrong. We have not achieved either our development goals or our environmental goals, Suki, but we do believe we can get there.
One of the questions you asked is that the failure to act is one of the factors is with regard to climate change. Maybe people start more suspicious of scientific basis of climate change. And that is the thing I would like to address briefly. And I have been working on this problem for about 50 years, modeling climate change. And now the Blue Planet Prize is the last 20 years, covered last 20 years. Actually, that happened to be similar to IPCC period, which started about 1990. So the question is, what has changed in the science of climate? And after all these struggles, there is still large uncertainty in our projection of climate change. But last 20 years, one of the major contributions of IPCC and all other scientists, the large number, huge thousands, when I originally started about 50 years ago, only few people working. Now the many thousands, tens of thousands people involved in it. But still, our model is not good enough to tell you absolute certainty what's going to happen in the future. But one thing what happened is, if you look at model projection, and if you look at observation, not only in-situ observation, but also look at remote sensing, you know, all these things monitored, how temperature changes, geographically changes, how snow cover has been changing, how sea level has been changing. And what is really amazing is many of the projections which I made about 20 years ago, it's all come out, panning out to be what is happening. And so that although people may criticize or talk about uncertainty is so large, but I think that science of climate change is more sound than any time in the past. And so this is, I think, is the change which happened in the last 20 years is amazing credibility, so far as I can see, is a merge between observation and climate modeling.
Dr. Sato.
Yeah. Because of illness, I was a little late in attending this meeting, and therefore my views are quite different from the ones that have been expressed so far. And not only are they different, some of you may find them extreme. All right? I believe that the only way to solve this climate problem, last year we had 30 billion tons of CO2 put in the atmosphere. This far exceeds our ability so far to decrease the amount of CO2. And the only hope of decreasing CO2 is to use plants that can grow in seawater. All right? Now, we have, in Eritrea, we've solved how to make mangrove trees grow where mangrove trees wouldn't grow. And they only grow where fresh water flows into the sea. And so we figured that this must be that the fresh water is bringing minerals that are not found in seawater that are necessary for plants. And so we compared the composition of algae medium with seawater and found only 3 elements were missing from seawater, namely nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. And if you add these 3 to seawater, you can make anything that can grow in seawater grow. Now, it turns out that we've grown over 1 million mangrove trees in areas where mangrove trees never grew before. And so the idea that you add nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron is proven, I think, without a doubt. Now, if we can grow plants, let's say mangrove trees, in the desert with seawater by adding nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron, think what that would mean. We can fill the Sahara Desert with mangrove trees. And this would be sufficient to remove the amount of CO2 that we now add to the atmosphere. We add 30 billion tons per year. This could take up that amount. Also, if we fertilize those areas of the sea that are shallow, it turns out that these areas are huge. They're more than enough to remove all the CO2 from the atmosphere. In fact, we will have to worry about removing too much CO2 from the atmosphere. It could be that we remove so much that photosynthesis can't go on. But if the trouble with fertilizing the shallow ocean is that useful plants and toxic algae like red tide have the same requirements. And so man has been afraid to fertilize the ocean for fear of producing red tide. We have found a way to produce useful plants without encouraging the growth of red tide or microalgae. And what we do is we make a brick of cesium chloride, which is gypsum, and we add diammonium phosphate and urea. That provides the nitrogen, phosphorus, and we just throw it in the ocean. The ball sinks to the bottom and the bed sinks into the mud. And then we throw pieces of iron. And what this does is it allows the plants that root in the sea bottom soil to get the fertilizer and not the algae. And this way, I have done this in Massachusetts, where it's illegal, right? And what we've grown is eelgrass and kelp. They grow luxuriously.
Given we've only got about another 5 minutes for the press conference, I think we have to ask others for questions.
Okay, well, let me finish.
Can you?
All right. And these areas where seagrass and kelp grow are rich in fish and crabs and sea life. So what we can do is not only can we grow plants to remove the CO2, excess CO2 from the atmosphere, but we can enrich the population. And it turns out that the most effective and humane way of controlling population growth is to make people rich. And I think we can do that.
Other questions?
I've got a question. I was wondering, when you talk about this urgent manifesto, or things that need to do urgently, what evidence do you see among urgency among the public? And if you don't see so much, one would argue that maybe there isn't that much urgency among the public to make, to heed this this call. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that there isn't the you know, I mean, John talked about grassroots movements, but I don't think one could argue that there's a global grassroots movement for this kind of sustainable development. That may want to quibble with that. But anyway,
Look at Occupy Wall Street. Look at the...
Yeah, but Occupy Wall Street was a very strong...
No, but the point is, that's why we tie education. In other words, people are unhappy with the state of the world. You have the Arab Spring and all that sort of thing. But the issue is they don't know, they know they're getting screwed, but they don't know what some of the things that are even worse than they're facing. The financial system could be fixed instantly if we wanted to, but we don't. But that, we're trying, we're doing, a lot of us are working very hard to get civil society together and start changing, bring it up from below, but as you perfectly well know, if you look at the blogs, you gotta be very careful what you bring up from below. And it's not a trivial issue.
I think your point is a well taken one, and I think there is indeed confusion. And I would actually say some of it by the media or our lack to communicate, that quite often there's always two sides to a story. These group of scientists say this is what's happening to biodiversity or climate change, and then you find the contrarian or denier saying exactly the opposite. So I think actually for the public at large, they are possibly confused. How can they tell which group of scientists or which media to actually sort of listen to and read? So quite often it's controversy that makes a story, and it's a controversy that actually I think confuses the public at large. So I think there is a real responsibility of the media to actually lay out what I believe the hard facts are, which I think are well represented in these national and very large international assessments, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, an assessment that Jose has just been president of called the Global Energy Assessment, the International Agriculture Assessment I directed. So there are always going to be some scientists disagree with a very large majority. But I think the question is, how do we get these messages across to the public that don't confuse them? Quite often the deniers or the contrarians know nothing about the subject. About a week ago there was a story or a letter to the Wall Street Journal which was published by 16 quite eminent scientists, not one of them a true climate scientist. Good scientists in their own field, but not a subject they really knew about. So 38 of us wrote a thing back saying, if you've got a gynecological problem, would you go to a motor mechanic to solve it? And that is really what's happening, to be quite honest, that we've got deniers who are truly not expert in these various fields, who are indeed having voice, and the public's getting confused. So you're right, we need the public to understand the seriousness of these issues.
Can I just add a little to that? I wasn't actually talking about just that. I was also talking about actually the impacts of the public feel. And you were talking about climate change and climate change. There is uncertainty. And I know that's talking from a Western kind of bias here. But you don't really in Britain feel the impacts of climate change, and therefore you don't really have that urgency, I don't think. And you can talk about models and how bad it's going to be. But isn't that a problem?
But again, that's an educational problem. We don't train people to lock in on that little increase in CO2 in the famous chart from Mauna Kea and so on. But it can be done. Our education system needs to be changed all the way to the top, and our public education, and it's the top as well, public education in the U.S. at least is ghastly.
I think you're right. Well, there's many reasons why I think the world successfully addressed the issue of stratospheric ozone depletion. One, it was much simpler, technologically simpler, economic. But there was one word in the English dictionary scares the hell out of light-skinned people: cancer. The end product of human-induced ozone depletion was cancer, melanoma and non-melanoma. And people said, is it worth an underarm spray deodorant to risk, even a risk, cancer? No. If you're in a developing country, a small island state, Bangladesh, their equivalent is losing their livelihoods. And so we don't quite have, you're absolutely correct, we don't have the cancer equivalent of climate change in the UK or in the US. The closest will be more extreme weather events for floods or heat waves, heat stress, mortality. In developing countries, they do have the cancer equivalent, and it's complete loss of livelihoods. It's actually, if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got hunger, agricultural productivity will go down. You've got water shortages. It'll become even more scarce in the arid and semi-arid areas. Already got poor infrastructure for healthcare. increase in malaria and dengue fever, etc., etc. So those areas of the world that have already got poverty problems, hunger problems, water problems, human health problems, are absolutely going to be adversely affected both by climate change and and loss of biodiversity, and as Emil said, poor development decisions. So there they get it far more. Here, they will be insidious changes, but they won't grab people in a way that say, the cancer issue grab people.
But extreme events are very difficult.
Extreme will be the one that I think will grab people.
Exactly.
Just the
But
solutions.
you guys have got to transmit it right, because all the extreme events in our climate, in our weather, in the U.S. media, virtually no connection was made to the possibility that these are the sorts of things that Manabe and so on have predicted.
I think you need to be more specific. I mean, most of what you said, I mean, yes, fine, we agree with it and we've heard it, and some of it was said in Rio and you've re-established all that. And you can talk about being holistic and system-based, but actually, if politics is going to happen here, you've got to be very specific. You've got to say, you know, we want to ban coal within 10 years, or we want to do this, or we want to do that. Really specific things.
Well, we are saying, and maybe we're not that specific, I would agree, we are saying we need an end to the fossil fuel era. I mean, we are saying you've got to invest in limiting population. We are saying you must go beyond using GDP as a measure of wealth, that we need other measures of wealth and take other aspects of human well-being. We are saying the present energy system is actually unsustainable and we must go to a low-carbon economy. We are saying you must value biodiversity and take it into account in decision-making. We are saying you must look at the governance structure and vested interests that are corrupting the government, and we must have a change. And we are saying that we need to train people to understand what it means to sort of look at that. So we haven't said get rid of coal in 10 years. You're absolutely right, Fred. So we are making some statements. Maybe they have to be even more hard-hitting. Suki, Jose.
I think you are right that, for example, picking up the issue of global warming, that if you look at the temperature alone, it's more of the future generation problem. That is, we are not feeling it as badly as. And so there is the political system every 4 years or 2 years of election, and they are not motivated to worry about future generations. And I think that is a problem. But one of the problems, like biodiversity, it's happening right now. The species is depleting very rapidly, although I'm not an expert. But fishes population is decreasing, and all these things happen. That is happening right now.
But so is climate change, Suki, but what you're saying is a little worse.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say next. The one of the piece I put in this appendix of this report is water problem. And there is a water problem a little bit like a capitalist system. The model predicts the place where it's suffering from water shortage right now. Where are they? The Sahel region of Africa, Middle East, and Australia is already suffering from drought. And then the contrast between water-rich part and water-poor part. Where is water-rich part? What is happening? One of the things is that frequency of flood has increased. Like Thailand, Japanese car company have to close these factories. And what is happening is that all models says that the once a 100-year flood is going to happen once every 10 years. And things of that kind. So far as the water problem is concerned, we are going to facing this problem increasingly. If you look at one place, it's very difficult to pin down. You say flood is going to frigate, but that's such a sporadic phenomenon. How you can prove it? We can prove it by looking at satellite observation of rainfalls and global frequency histograms. Gradually tells you. This is one of the things we have to put more emphasis on in order to prove what is happening right now. But these are the problems that we have to draw more attention of the public. They are not a sporadic random phenomenon, but there is an underlying causes which is causing.
Jose.
You're right. You know, in 1992, the same question was raised about 20 years ago. We had the Climate Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, which are in general. You know, they said, look, you have to do better. You know, you have to improve this and that, but it was not specific. It was a big debate. You know, but it was a miracle that government had agreed at least that there was a real problem. Now, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, which had numbers. You know, then you have to do this, you know, to reduce emissions by X%, etc. And now we have the protocol for biodiversity. So I think you're quite right, and I think it's up to the political system to convert these warnings, you know, into concrete measures. And one hopes that in Rio +20 in June, some of that would be done. The document that was prepared, which is by the United Nations, is weak in that respect, you know. But I think there's still time to strengthen, and the national governments ought to do it. You know, UK, not the United States, no hope. but some of the European countries.
What's wrong with Brazil?
Yeah, and Brazil too. Yeah.
I mean, Fred, I mean, we would strongly support the 2 degrees, even the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set by governments to limit greenhouse gas emissions. What we're pointing out here is we think we're on a course to 3 to 5, which would be catastrophic. So I think hopefully the governments of the world and others will see what these messages are basically, and that is, hell it, we've got to do better. We can do better. The point is, we do believe we can. The political system can be reformed. We do believe there will be technological solutions, but boy, it needs all of us to act, and really act at scale now. Time is definitely not on our side.
If we had 1,000 years, we'd all be relaxed.
Yeah.
Naomi Mihara from Yomiuri Shimbun. Given the current economic stagnation that's felt in many countries across the world, how realistic do you think is that now is a good time, is a time when governments will actually choose to act because they're worried?
I could argue that's a good reason to act. In other words, if you look at the climate issue, just take that one first, and I'll do biodiversity. Half of it is changing the way we produce energy, but the other half is how we consume energy. This ought to be the real time to grab the whole energy efficiency agenda and really move it forward. Equally on biodiversity, now is the time to conserve and sustainably use our natural resources, not waste our natural resources. So you're right, is it the right time to put massive investments in new technology? We've got lots of technologies that are not going to solve the problem, but can move us in the right direction, that are sitting on the shelf that we ought to start now. So even with an economic downturn, end-use efficiency, efficient use of natural resources, biological and water, make eminent sense, even more in an economic downturn. And we have technologies we can start to use. Some of the wind energy, some of the new solar is starting to get viable. So in reality, the economic downturn should not be used as an excuse to not act.
Particularly when we need jobs.
Yeah.
You know, we got to revise our entire water handling structure and our entire energy handling structure over the whole planet. That would create enormous numbers of jobs. much more than most of the other things that we do. And jobs, if you talk to the economists, they're going to be the thing that's going to be slow and a drag on everything. We can do it.
But you're right, it is being, I think, in some places being used as an excuse for inaction.
Second China dialogue. Is there a contradiction here between the kind of desire to have what Dr. Toolman was saying, is, we need to get multilateralism right, so we need to have multilateralism now, really working right, and the desire to create this kind of holistic, integrated model of sustainable development, given that most of the multilateral processes that have been effective aren't those huge interconnected ones, they're actually the simple problems.
Well, that's something that Dr. Celine, and, well, not just Dr. but all of us have noted. What we tend to do is, even at the international level, is very sectoral. Energy ministers get together, environment ministers get together, finance ministers get together. We need systems, both at the national and the international level, that bring these together. That as you develop an energy system, you need to think through what are the implications for food, for water, for transportation. When you think about agriculture, you need to think in the other direction. So the challenge, I think, we have, not just at the global level, but I would argue at the national level, is how do you get government departments to work together, and with civil society and business, but within government, work together on these cross-sectoral issues. So we have been looking at environmental sustainability and social and economic. We haven't truly integrated them, and that's a key point that we're trying to make in our paper. We absolutely, what that international governance structure is an interesting one. Theoretically, the best option is heads of state, when they meet, who truly understand these dimensions, basically, rather than the same time getting all the energy ministers, all the environment ministers, all the agriculture. That's not going to happen. So we need to think through what is a regional way of getting the right people to discuss across sectors. Any other questions? If not, really appreciate you coming, and we've had some, we are going to finish our 10-page, it'll actually be a 15-page paper by the time. We'll send it to all of you, it'll be finished by the end of the week, and actually we'll publish not only the 2-page, the 15-pager, but all the individual contributions also. We would hope to finish in about time. We'll put them on the Ashai Glass website, but we'll also put them on conservation website, IIED, etc., and our own personal ones. But we'll send them to you so you can actually see some of the more in-depth views of the individuals and how we've actually brought it together. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. Hi, Ben. Thanks for coming. Thank
You're from Indonesia. Very interested in
We've actually read all the documents. Well, unfortunately, No, well, in fact, when I became an American citizen, their form is still fairly old. And now I was born in England, and I then moved to America and became a citizen. The form has, I think, about 4 steps. Most of them are easy. There's a few tricky ones, not all of them, but a few tricky ones that many people have one or more between 19 and 23. And you fill in the form, of course, if the answer is yes to anything, I said so. You write no to everything. Anyway, when the lady interviewed me, we went to question 28, 29, and so maybe 30, but it was not. So we get she goes, and said, every question I ask you on the Bible, you have to answer honestly. Okay, fine. We'll introduce each other when we get there.
Oh, okay.
Yes, please. Please take a seat. It works.
It's working?
Yeah, it works.
Okay.
Would you please explain us about the capacity? And when the light becomes remote,
Yeah.
it works.
But you gotta admit, it's more likely to be true than all fraud.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because of this. Ah.
By about a dozen of us here, not everyone could come to the meeting, but it was based on the contributions of the papers that you see at the very top. So there's a two-page summary. There's about a 15-page report that probably will be finalised within the next, well, will definitely be finalised within the next week. And then each of the contributors have written their own, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000, 2,500 word document. So you'll see a document at the end that is the key messages, a 15-page summary, and a series of 20 contributions from each of the individual contributors. We're going to present the paper next week, Monday week, February the 20th, in the ministerial session of the UNEP Governing Council meeting. We'll also give it in the opening session of Planet Under Pressure, which will be a large meeting of between 2,000 and 5,000 scientists here in London in March. And we hope to present it at a meeting that Camilla is organising in Rio. So we want to try and get our message out of what we think the issues are. Now, as you can see from this page, and I'll do it very, very quickly, because you should ask questions of all of the Blue Planet laureates that have effectively written this paper. What we point out is we actually do have a dream. We have a dream of a world without poverty, a world that's equitable, etc., a world that will look at issues such as climate change and biodiversity, but the current system is broken and the current pathway will not realise it. So we've then said, very simply, what do we think we need to address and what does the world need to address now? Clearly got to get to grips with the issue of population size and consumption patterns. It's both together. Therefore, there really should be additional investment and urgency around the issue of education for all, especially girls though, empowerment of women, healthcare of children and the elderly, and making modern contraception available for all. Secondly, we'd like to point out that GDP is not a good measure of economic growth, and that indeed we should either complement it or replace it by the four forms of capital: built capital, natural capital, human capital, and social capital. We believe the world needs to get to grips with environmentally damaging subsidies in energy, transportation, and agriculture. They don't help most of the poor, but they do cause environmental degradation. We need to internalise these externalities, in other words, the social and environmental costs of some of the damaging technologies we use, such as coal, oil, and gas. We should internalise them. If you do that, you get a much more level playing field for renewable energy technology, and we must start to put true value, economic and non-economic, on ecosystem goods and services, and take into account when we make decisions the value of biodiversity and our ecosystems in all decision making. We then point out that the present energy system needs to be reformed. We need to make sure that we get access to modern energy for all, especially in poor developing countries where energy access is absolutely critical. But we need them to move away from firewood and dung, where so many children and elderly die of smoke inhalation at a very early age. We need a transition to a low carbon economy. We need to focus both on energy production and energy use. And therefore renewable energy, carbon capture and storage are key technologies that we need to look at. We recognise again biodiversity has incredible value, social, economic, spiritual, scientific, but we're losing it at an unprecedented rate, a rate that has not been seen on Earth for 65 million years, and it's being due to human activity. We don't value it, and therefore it has we waste and destroy it, basically. And therefore, as I've already said, we need to create markets for ecosystem services and a basis of a true green economy, along with a transition to a low carbon economy. We then point out there's very serious shortcomings in our decision-making systems, both within government at the national, regional and global level. We note that vested interests play a very critical role in influencing government, and that effectively we need to have much more transparent means of holding those in power to account. We point out there are ways to do it at the local level through things such as our public hearing, social audits, etc. But we also have to realise there's major failures at the national level and at the international level. And one of the failures is simply that we make all decisions sectorially: energy, water, transportation, agriculture, forestry, etc. We've got to bring all of those together. So there's a systemic failure in the way we deal with environmental, social and environmental issues. And we actually point out that while we've always recognised the importance of the 3 pillars of sustainability, they've been looked at almost in parallel, and we need to fully integrate these various dimensions of economic, social and environmental sustainability. We also wanted to note that there are some really good actions going on the ground in the way sort of local people look at energy, food, water, natural resources. But basically then of a level that are not going to make a difference unless we can scale them up. So we need both a top-down and a bottom-up approach to sustainability. Learn from those actions that are happening at the grassroots level in both developed and developing countries. Get the governments to put national and global policies in place that will empower grassroots action. So there is a lot to learn from grassroots, but the efforts they're making are not of a scale that will solve the problems. We also need competent decision makers, both in business and in government. A training of how can you think about sustainability? What are the boundaries of sustainability? So we don't make mistakes of trying to solve one problem, creating another one. One we point out is use of biofuels. With the exception of sugarcane in Brazil, rarely have first generation biofuels been effective. Maize in America is really not a very sensible policy. It's not particularly pro-environmental, and it makes no economic sense whatsoever. So when we look at how do you address biodiversity, climate change, food security, water security, energy and human security, you've got to understand the whole system, the complexity of it, in order then to simplify it, and therefore we need both knowledge and training of decision makers in government and in the private sector. Clearly, education is a crucial issue throughout the world. Research and assessment is crucial. We don't lack knowledge to know we must act now, but more knowledge will allow, especially on adaptation and the transition to a low carbon economy, to be even more effective. Lastly, in order to achieve this dream of a sustainable world, an equitable world, a fair world, a world without discrimination for women, we have to recognise this major inertia in the socio-economic system. In other words, you can't suddenly go to a low-carbon economy overnight. It takes time to get a low-carbon car in the light. It takes time to transition from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy. But there's also major inertia in the climate system, that once you change climate, and if you don't like the consequences, it takes centuries, and for sea level, millennia, to reverse the damage. And with biodiversity, some of that loss is totally and utterly irreversible, i.e. species loss. Therefore, the time to act is now, and failure to act will impoverish both the current and future generations. They're the key conclusions of this group. So everyone's got their name in front of them, so the question should not just be asked me. Everybody here has made contributions. I'm just a scribe and a cheerleader.
What's changed in the last 20 years?
Who wants to take it? What has changed in the last 20 years?
I mean, I heard, you know, I was in Rio first time, I'm afraid.
Absolutely, as far as a personal opinion, essentially nothing. We are not on a course towards sustainability, as you may know, will become the only word in the English language in about, 10 years from now, the rate that it's increasing. We're not remotely on a course that's going to let us be sustainable. If you know the footprint analysis, we're already operating at a level with 2 or 3 billion people poor, where you need 1.5 Earths to be able to support it permanently. And we're going to add 2.5 billion people, if you believe the estimates, and the estimates are right. They may be, the results may be wrong because they depend on death rate figures, and we don't know what's going to go on there. But, for example, I've never seen it mentioned in the U.S. Mass media, that there are nonlinearities in that the next 2.5 billion people will do more damage, much more damage, than the last 2.5 billion people that were added to the planet, because of course we picked the low-hanging fruit first. Talking about the competence of leadership, I don't know if you've been listening to the debates among the 7 dwarfs. I think they're down to 3 now. But I've not heard the mass media in the States mention the fact that the more people you have, ceteris paribus, the more greenhouse gases you're going to have. So that'll be, I could give you an hour-and-a-half rant, as God knows, but I'll stop now and let somebody else rant.
Let me ask Jose his views. Jose has had 3 ministerial positions in Brazil, was certainly a player in Rio, and will obviously be a player in Rio +20. Jose, do you want to make a comment?
Well, at the local level, some progress has been made. You know, surprisingly enough, you know, Agenda 21, which was not a legal document, you know, it was not a convention or a treaty, had played an important role in teaching mayors and the state governors and so on to do a number of things. And one example that you know well is that California, the state of California, is ahead of the United States. You know, it adopted a cap for carbon emissions. The state of São Paulo, which is my home state, has also adopted. It's in a developing country, and China has been making progress. You know, it's a strange kind of progress. You know, they do progress. They did a lot of progress in reducing the intensity of the energy use, but they're growing so fast that offsets the progress. But it will catch on if they continue. I don't know in detail the 5-year plan, but I think some of my colleagues here know. In the 5-year plan, they will catch up. You know, you see, the reason is that developing countries now, as far as emissions are concerned, and loss of biodiversity, are doing as much bad as the developed countries. You know, so there are big players. You know, China emits today as much as the United States. But these countries, the developing countries, are leapfrogging. You know, the technologies that are being introduced in China and in Brazil and some other countries are modern technologies. You know, the idea that the old colonies first adopt the obsolete technologies and then repeat the process that you had here in England, in the United States, and so on, is not correct. They leapfrog, and there is hope there, but it's hope. You know, I mean, responding to your question, I mean, the whole progress in the 20 years since 1992 has been much less than impressive.
I mean, one of the things we say in our paper, as you know, in Copenhagen, reiterated in Cancun and reiterated in Durban, is governments around the world committed themselves to try to limit greenhouse gas emissions to stabilize the global mean surface temperature to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above 1990, and the AOSIS countries, of course, called for 1.5 limit. What we say in our paper is that the world's current commitments to reduce emissions are consistent with at least, stress least, a 3 degrees Celsius rise, and that's only a 50-50 shot. And effectively that hasn't been seen for 3 million years. And a serious risk of 5 degrees Celsius, something not seen for 30 million years on this planet.
And of course that's the average temperature.
Yes.
When you then look at the gradient between ocean and land and between lower and higher latitudes, you see massively more than that 3 to 5. And you also, of course, see the impact of extreme events, which is very often what causes a lot of the damage. Just to say a couple of other things. I mean, I think, thinking back to Rio 20 years ago, I think we had a very unreasonable faith in the power of government to make sensible plans and to act upon them. So if one thing's happened between now and then, I think it's the loss of innocence, if you like. The loss of that innocence in believing that government was wise, benevolent, far-sighted, able to take those long-term, difficult, collective decisions for each nation. That's been blown completely out of the water. Where do you see a progressive government today? Well, possibly Denmark. And thank goodness that Denmark has the presidency of the EU in the current 6 months. I think they're putting a huge amount of weight on their shoulders to show a bit of ambition for this particular part of the world. I mean, I think the other thing which was very clearly flagged up by Professor Goldenberg is that the world is a very much different place today than 20 years ago. It's a much flatter planet. It's these sort of false dichotomies between North and South make absolutely no sense now. And I'm actually quite encouraged at the way in which we've got both the G20, but also a range of other middle-income countries who are starting to step forward and say, you know, we need multilateralism that works. We need not only the G20, but also a bigger platform. Look at the government of Colombia, for instance. Colombia has been really pushing hard for Rio to be the moment at which, collectively, we say we've got to build a more sustainable planet. Let's agree a set of global sustainability goals that can really drive forward investment and commitment.
Emil, do you want to give a perspective from Indonesia?
Yes. What has changed has been explained, but what has not changed is the politics. The 20 years ago, there was still disregard for the environment and unwillingness to change the economic system, market, in accordance to the need of sustainable development. That also has not changed. So, in Bill Clinton's office, it's the economy stupid, now it's the politics stupid. So the politics of 2012 has not changed with the politics of 1992. And that is a determining factor why we feel that change is necessary.
How was this?
Yes, what happened since 1992? The Asahi Foundation was founded that year, that tried to follow and track what was happening over the years, and each year some laureates have come forth and given their view of what's happening. But to me, what's most discouraging right now is this loss of innocence, as you say, that the governments are going to help us. 20 years ago, a meeting was held for 2 weeks. Heads of state were there to pound out these 2 major conventions. They failed on a couple of others they had in mind. But this 20 years later, we're going to have a 3-day conference, no heads of state. Now, what does that mean? Have the governments too lost confidence in being able to accomplish things the way we've done? That means we need a new way. We've got to have a new way forward. We have to call attention to what the issues are and how we're going to Well, it's calling for revolution, actually. I think that many of the things we have in the bullet points here, without those revolutionary changes and a new spirit, a new, within governments and between governments, we're not going to get where we need to go. And hopefully it's all going to change.
Will, do you want to comment from Conservation International perspective?
Yeah, so there has been this loss of innocence, particularly with governments, and we do need to continue to work with countries and governments at all levels and hold them accountable and engage them in this process. But at the same time, we need to be looking to a broader, we're talking about problems that impact all of society, all sectors and all segments of society. So we need to look broader than just at the certainly international government level and beyond that to local governments and to the business community in particular. We may be facing challenges that seem more dire than ever, but we're also at a moment where I think that the corporate sector, the private sector, has never been more, there's never been higher interest in proactively engaging on environmental issues. All of humanity needs nature to survive and to thrive, not just in some primitive sort of Stone Age way, but to solve modern problems like climate change, infectious diseases, and maintain supply chains for major corporations. So corporations need to be, and the private sector and markets need to be a big part of the solution to solving these problems.
Anyone else want to say anything more? Okay, next question. I thought, we'll normally only have one or two people answer that. That was such a broad question. I thought getting very different perspectives as well.
So, jumping out, going in. So if not governments are failing, it's coming back to your point. Are you really just saying we have to hand it over to corporations? I mean, where is the role of ordinary people? Where is the role of the grassroots? Are you honestly saying that corporates are now going to defend the earth? These are the guys, these are the bad guys, surely.
No, I'm not sure we can categorise everyone as good or bad that simply. We actually are saying that all actors have to work together. We need government to get the right policies in place. But also, some of the private sector are ahead of governments, and they are actually, in some states in America, ahead of the federal government. So there's good and bad in all, basically. But the grassroots we can learn a lot from. So I think what we're arguing is we need all actors, whether it's governments, whether it's a private sector, whether it's the NGOs, all the way down to the grassroots. We need all of them to start to move in a direction to become more sustainable. The grassroots alone, where there's some really good things going on, it's not at the scale and the pace we need. So we do need government to be more reactive. We need private sector to be more sustainable, and some of the private sector are being quite socially and environmentally responsible. Others are not, basically. So we need an ensemble of everybody to move this thing forward. No one entity is going to solve this on their own.
To give an example, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development did the first backcasting exercise that I've seen, far ahead of even DARPA in the U.S., where we have really no foresight institution. So whether you like corporations or not, they're going to have to play a major role. There are, of course, issues that regulate them, particularly in a globalized world. But
I mean, I think what corporations and civil society can do is to give government permission to move much faster and further. I get the impression that people in government are just kind of so scared. They're scared of the electoral cycle, they're scared of the lobbyists, they're scared of people coming out on the streets, and as a consequence, they're kind of frozen into a lack of an ambition, a lack of action. I think what you can do is to say, to encourage them to be bold, to say, if you go in that direction, we'll follow you. Just do it. And that's the kind of joint working together, which I think is key.
I didn't mean to imply that we can count on corporations to do it alone. We must engage corporations. Some corporations are more amenable to that kind of action than others. We certainly have a long way to go. And that's not just NGOs or others engaging corporations. The public plays a large role in that. And a specific example of that, palm oil. The oil palm plantations are a huge issue around many of the tropical countries, in particular Indonesia. And the European consumer market played a major role in changing the behaviors of not all yet, but a significant part of that production sector.
Can I add an additional question?
Sure.
Is not the problem America? Just by chuck it out.
Don't beat up on us. It's bad enough.
I mean, let's put it this way. My personal view is until we get the US to start to show leadership and transition to a low carbon economy, it's going to be very difficult to expect a number of developing countries, such as India, to make significant strides forward. So I think it's actually crucial that we get the US to move in the right direction. It's important insofar as they are the second largest emitters in the world and one of the largest per capita emitters. China's now the largest single emitter, but it's still 4 times less per capita than the US. And so while the US may not be the largest emitter, it's the second largest, it's still around 20 to 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So getting the US to move, and actually to get the technical might of the US, along with the emerging technical might of China and other countries, is going to be absolutely crucial to go to this low carbon economy. And it's going to take a technological evolution. We're going to need to put a price on carbon, and we need behaviour change. So it's not simply technology or policy or behaviour change, it's how do you bring the 3 together. Most of the most important biodiversity in the world is in many developing countries. And we have to be very careful that we in the North don't simply say, don't use fossil fuels because that's how we got rich in the North. Don't deforest because that's what we did in the North. So we've got to form real partnerships, North-North, North-South and South-South. And so we really need a whole different way of moving forward.
I mean, one of the interesting things is that President Hu is actually one of the few heads of state who said he is going to Rio. And I think that ought to make the US quite worried. I mean, this is an agenda, a low-carbon agenda, a sustainability agenda, that the Chinese government have very much flagged up as theirs, if you look at things like their low-carbon strategy. So that, I think one hope in getting the US and some of the other more laggards in the system to move faster is to say, if you don't move now, you will have lost that market. You will have lost the big markets of the 21st century.
Let me interpolate what Bob said a little bit. The problems are even more fundamental than he indicated. He certainly indicated them in the north-south, east, west, blah, 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 routine. But basically, the world governance system is broken, as we indicate in there. We don't have any, any of you, there was a time when the U.S. belonged to England and Britain, and we moved away from it. And there was a big argument in the United States about how 13 different entities could both work together in doing things like preventing the Brits from coming back, but retain their individuality and so on. If you think about it, the state system is only 200 years old, and we really face exactly the same sort of thing. We need to do some things corporately as a group of nations where we still don't, we have a network of agreements and so on, but we don't have any regime that holds the whole thing together. That's a really critical thing. If you don't hit the governance level at that level, I don't think you're going to solve the problems. And the second one, which I was talking with one of the greatest economists last night in England, we were discussing the issue of why economists and politicians, presumably all of whom can do arithmetic, think that you can have economic growth that will go on at 3.5% or 5% in perpetuity. I only have to point out at 3.5%, we will double our impact on the environment if you consider the nonlinearities of 10 or 20 years, and we're already desperate. So economic growth, I admit to being a fan of President Obama, particularly because he got the best science advice any American president has ever had, even if he doesn't listen to it. But every time he gives a speech, the issue is how do we get back to 3.5% growth? I'll bet it's the same thing. I haven't watched enough BBC here yet. But economic growth is seen as the cure to all our problems. Obviously, we need some form of growth for the billions of people who are in poverty. But the idea that we, in the rich countries, have to continue to grow and consume ever more is, I think, in the view of, this may be just my personal view, but I think virtually everybody here agrees that there's going to have to be some kind of redistribution, and that the rich countries just should not have the goal to continually grow. Is there anybody here who disagrees with that? I'm just curious.
Well, there's certainly got to be a very different growth model, clearly, that we've got a finite planet, and the question is how do we get a more equitable planet and one that is sustainable.
think that's right. I think the nature of growth, we need growth, but a different kind of growth. And a good example of that, Dr. Goldenberg mentioned this leapfrogging. In the state of Amapá in Brazil, they've actually had an increase in the protection of their forest and a decrease in deforestation rates, and in the same period have an increase in their Human Development Index, HDI. So that's a growth, but it's not measured by GDP. It's getting at issues of equality and the distribution of wealth and whether everybody's benefiting from it.
And Bob, on this question of leadership, you have to remember that developing countries are in the tropical areas. That's where the sun is, So since we are moving to solar energies, the chances that developing countries will benefit from solar energies is much better than countries in the north. So this emergence of the BRICS countries, the countries in the tropical areas, is sort of locked together with the emergence of renewable energies. If they are going to succeed, that's the place where they're going to succeed. Of course, the technological developments in the United States and England and so on, Denmark and so on, are very welcome, but the massive introduction of these technologies is going to be in the south.
Mike Swain, Daily Mirror. A few sort of questions, comments, really. The impression I get from you all is a sense of failure and a lack of confidence. So it goes back to the first question, and on what has changed. But it's as if there's a feeling here in this room of frustration, and that despite enormous organisations, international organisations, publicity around the world, nothing seems to be moving forward very much. And I wonder whether anyone would like to comment on the fact that maybe the climate change debate has undermined some of the aims, and that climate change is obviously part of the problems we face, but the overall problems of feeding the growing population, sustainability, that's kind of like a wider thing of which climate change is only a part, and the climate change maybe has diverted attention away from some of the obviously very important things that you're saying. And just finally, I wonder whether you're saying that basically we need to stop population growth. Can we have any kind of population growth and a sustainable world? And just finally, there's a sense in some of your aims of a contradiction in a way, in that eradicating poverty, empowering women, if we're having a growing population and we're eradicating poverty, then those people are going to be using up more resources. I mean, obviously, if we can find ways.
Very wise question. The first one, I was at a press conference before the 2008 election, I guess it was, trying to bring environmental issues back into the discussion in the United States. As you know, they're hardly there at all. And every single question from the reporters was on climate change. And there are a number of us ecologists who are not at all sure that climate change, we think it's going to be catastrophic, but we're not sure, for example, it's more serious than the toxification, the loss of biodiversity, things that we haven't mentioned, the environmental things, including climate change that could lead to a small nuclear war, which would destroy England and the United States as well, if you've seen the most recent literature, or what's happening to the epidemiological environment, which I wish Bob May were here to discuss. I mean, we have, first of all, I would say personally, I feel that my entire career is